You kind of touched on, the transport there, the Kindertransport. Can you explain how your family was involved in like the Kino Palace and the Kindertransport, and what kind of impact it had, you think, on the world at that time?
Well, the Kindertransport scheme started incredibly quickly after Kristallnacht. It's now called the November Pogrom or the Night of Broken Glass, when essentially National Socialists rampaged across Germany and Austria, smashing synagogues and Jewish businesses. Within 3 weeks, rescued the first train carrying unaccompanied children. The whole of the Kindertransport scheme was unaccompanied children, generally aged between about 4 and 16, something 15. And their parents or a family member would take them to a mainline station, and they would get the famous luggage labels put around their necks, and they were brought across by strangers. And they travelled across Germany or Austria or wherever, Holland, and then the sea, and they arrived in Britain. Now, these children had no idea where they were going. And some ended up in hostels, some ended up in family homes, some were exploited. And in the case of my grandmother, she was a refugee herself. She arrived in Britain in December 1938. And yet by January, she was on her way to Newcastle, to Tynemouth, to be matron in a hostel for children brought over on the Kindertransport. And it was a group of friends in Newcastle who decided that they must do something to help these children. There was a very informal committee. There are no minutes or anything like that. But they did appeal to the local synagogues, that the local rabbis asked for support. And the different villages supported in different ways. Some did subscriptions, some did bigger fundraising. And you have to remember, it was very poor then. The whole of the Northeast there was a lack of work and a lot of poverty. And these girls arrived. Most of them were taken to Liverpool Street Station in London, and then if there was no one to escort them, they were put on a train to Newcastle and collected by one of the matrons and taken to the hostel. Now, those children didn't know that Liverpool Street Station, which is a London mainline train station, they thought they'd gone to Liverpool. They didn't know what Newcastle was. And they didn't know if they were going to safety or they were being lured into some sort of terrible death. And what I haven't been able to find out is quite how many children there were. It's certainly over 25. It may be as many. Some came for long periods, some came for very short periods, particularly before the war started. Some parents managed to escape, or other family members came and got them. Some moved into other places. So I just don't know the answer to that. But there was certainly 25 there throughout the war.
I know there are a lot of passages in the book of, them recalling their own stories as well.
Yes. One thing that surprises me is how matter of fact they are about it, and the sort of common sense that Elfie in particular, yes, the matrons had sons, they were not used to girls, and they didn't know how unpleasant teenage girls could be. And, they just basically got on with it. Because they didn't really have there wasn't really, I suppose if you think about it, there wasn't that much alternative. Either you go on with it or you don't.
Yeah, that was their reality, right? I mean, like you're talking about, like it was like matter of fact to them, but those were the conditions, and I guess they had to kind of go through it and just try to survive, basically.
Yes, there's one thing is they're all very, very nice about the food in the hostel, because the matron was a famous cook. And one of the girls actually said, well, it didn't matter if the cheese was dry and crumbly, but we were always well fed. This is wartime, there's rationing.
Yeah, that's
most
interesting.
people weren't particularly well fed then.
So they were grateful for whatever support they received. Yeah.
It's really there's a big distinction. Some of them, like Elfie, said, look, they were second-hand clothes. They were cast-me-downs, but they were beautiful quality. Others said, "Oh, we had those dreary cast-down clothes." Well, no one had new clothes during the war, but some were more positive than others.
Okay.
So that's just describing different people.
Yeah, it's interesting, the different perspectives, right? I guess everyone copes with trauma and anything else differently from one another, right?
Yes, I don't think all of them coped not all of them coped as well as some.
Yeah,
Some were very
exactly.
bitter. Others, just the one I speak to most is Inga, who's 90 and lives in Wimbledon, which is South London. And she said, look, she'd been too busy living. What we would find surprising is how young these children were when they were just, cast into the world. And so the hostel closed. She was the youngest child there. She was 5.5 when she arrived. And so when the hostel closed in 1947, she was sent to a hostel in Manchester with her sister, and they were very unhappy. They'd gone from a very small village school to a much bigger, rougher school. And then they went to Israel, and then Inga came back, and she said, look, I was, working. I had to make a job. I had to support myself. And, it's only been recently, I think, that she's been bothered by people like me and the BBC and has been revisiting it.
During that time, they didn't really have time to contemplate on it or think about it much. They just had to move on with life and try to make, a living and support themselves. And
yes, because one girl was, she was actually the only non-German speaker to arrive. She was Czech. And so poor child arrives in England and she can't speak either German or English. So she can't really talk to anybody. I don't think my grandmother actually spoke. That surprised me, but I don't think my grandmother actually spoke very much Czech, I've decided. She was 14 at the end of the war. They basically moved her from the hostels to just by the time she'd learnt English, they then moved her to another hostel in Wales where it's for Czech children. But of course, she'd forgotten her Czech by then. And at 14, she was living independently in London. They're paying her an allowance and she's renting a room and working.
Wow.
Which
That's such a young age.
Yeah, well, to us, that would be extraordinary.
Yeah.
It would, yeah. You couldn't imagine. Yeah, some of the things these kids went through at such a young age would be unimaginable for today's kids because, we have so much, privilege and we're spoiled so much here that it's difficult to imagine
There's one
hard
clear
times.
pattern that the younger children seem to have coped better than the older children because the older children, after all, came from loving, supportive families. You've got to be very loving to send your child away like that. Whereas the younger children couldn't remember their families. So because there's both being separated from your parents and moving to an institutional life, which, I'm sure two women in their 50s coping with 25 girls. They had no domestic help, so all the work was shared out. And the girls all learned to cook, all learned to cook and things like that, which are very useful. But it must have been quite hard. No central heating; they had to collect the fuel.
Yeah, it wasn't an easy task to care for all these kids.